All right, welcome back. Today we're talking about The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. He is the New York Times best-selling author of Start With Why and Leaders Eat Last. So he's somebody that I've followed for a long time. He's got a lot of great content on YouTube and social media. He does a lot of public speaking and working with a variety of different companies and organizations to speak at their events, helping to improve culture and company incentive programs and the way we operate in general as a company to or organization to inspire people and get the best out of people and help them feel a worthy cause and to feel secure and safe and intentional at work. And so very interesting guy. I've appreciated a lot of his content and used a lot of it in my managerial positions to try and help my team in those very ways. So let's jump into the infinite game. To just set the stage a little bit of what is an infinite game versus a finite game, right? He says if there are at least two players, a game exists, and there are two kinds of games: finite games and infinite games. Finite games are played by known players. They have fixed rules, and there is an agreed upon objective that, when reached, ends the game. So sports or chess or whatever, right? Where it's like, these are the rules, this is the competition, this is the duration, this is the goal. And at the end, whoever's done the best at those metrics is the winner. Infinite games, in contrast, are played by known and unknown players. There are no exact or agreed upon rules. Infinite games have infinite time horizons. And because there is no finish line, no practical end to the game, there is no such thing as winning an infinite game. In an infinite game, the primary objective is to keep playing to perpetuate the game. For example, he says, there is no such thing as coming in first in marriage or friendship. Though school may be finite, there is no such thing as winning education. We can beat out our candidates for a job or a promotion, but no one is ever crowned the winner of a career. So he goes on to give a few more examples. He says, all these things are journeys, not events. However, if we listen to the language of so many of our leaders today, it's as if they don't know the game in which they're playing. They talk constantly about winning. They obsess about beating their competition. They announce to the world that they are the best. They state that their vision is to be number one, except that in games without finish lines, all of these things are impossible. When we lead with a finite mindset in an infinite game, it leads to all kinds of problems, the most common of which include the decline of trust, cooperation, and innovation. So that kind of sets the stage. If an infinite game is to be played for as long as possible and to serve as many people as possible, both the customer and the employee, right? Create this ecosystem that can produce and provide and serve as many people as possible. Right. We're going to get into a few examples. I'm not going to actually get into great detail on a lot of them because there's a bunch of good examples in the book that you should purchase the book and read. But he goes over, Apple's history, Microsoft, Sam Walton and Walmart. He goes through EpiPen stories. He goes through CVS, Walgreens, and Rite Aid, and a bunch more. Ford Motor Company. That at one point or another, they had an infinite leader. Then that leader steps down. They end up with a finite leader. And so he actually goes at Steve Ballmer in here, who replaced Bill Gates as the CEO of Microsoft. And basically, that, 10 years or so that he was the CEO, uh, his finite mindset drove the company down. He was obsessed with what Apple was doing. He was late to deliver products that Apple had already delivered and had moved on in creating something new. So, the first example, he says, a tale of two players, Microsoft versus Apple. He says, some years ago, I spoke at an education summit for Microsoft. A few months later, I spoke at an education summit for Apple. At the Microsoft event, the majority of the presenters devoted a good portion of their presentation to talking about how they were going to beat Apple. At the Apple event, 100% of the presenters spent 100% of their time talking about how Apple was trying to help teachers teach and help students learn. One group seemed obsessed on beating their competition. The other group seemed obsessed with advancing their cause. So he ended up sharing a cab with a very high level leader in Apple who had been there for many years. I think he was employee 56 or something in that range, and had been in there for a long time. He said, "I spoke at Microsoft, and they gave me their new Zune, and I have to tell you, it is so much better than your iPod Touch." The executive looked at me, smiled, and replied, "I have no doubt." And that was it. The conversation was over. The Apple exec was unfazed by the fact that Microsoft had a better product. Perhaps he was just displaying the arrogance of a dominant market leader. Perhaps he was putting on an act, a very good one. Or perhaps there was something else at play. Although I didn't know it at the time, his response was consistent with that of a leader with an infinite mindset. So, if you don't know the story of the Zune, basically Microsoft came out with the iPod, which revolutionized the way people use music. They weren't the first to the industry, by the way, but they had built iTunes, and then the iPod basically made this giant marketplace, which was very easy and cheap to download and carry your music around. So, of course, Microsoft, late to the game, and knowing that Apple just made tons of money off of this, they create a Zune that's better than the iPod. And indeed, it was, at least according to Simon. I've never actually seen one, and here's why. Because though it was very sleek and very user friendly and all that, it could not be used with Apple iTunes. So they had to go to other marketplaces, which were not as popular or user friendly. Also, only about a year later, Apple released their first iPhone, which rendered the iPod and the Zune essentially irrelevant to the marketplace. So, Microsoft and Steve Ballmer were so obsessed with trying to compete head to head with Apple that they were reacting to everything Apple did, but they didn't see things like the iPhone coming. So, that's the problem with a leader with a finite mindset leading a company. Is Apple is focused on how they can serve more, how they can innovate more, how they can change another industry or use their creative minds to create something new. While Microsoft's going, what are they doing? Well, let's do better. It's not a wise approach to business. Okay, so when that happens, when you get these finite leaders and the corporate structure is based upon that, you start to get worse results and the culture shifts, right? So let's jump into this a bit. He says, how a company is led must also be considered. Prioritizing comparison and winning above all else, finite-minded leaders will set corporate strategy, product strategy, incentive structures, and hiring decisions to help meet finite goals. And with a finite mindset firmly entrenched in almost all aspects of the organization, a sort of tunnel vision results, the result of which pushes almost everyone inside the company to place excessive focus on the urgent at the expense of the important. Executives instinctively start to respond to known factors instead of exploring or advancing unknown possibilities. And in some cases, leaders have become so obsessed with what the competition is doing, falsely believing that they need to react to their every move, that they become blind to a whole host of better choices to strengthen their own organization. It's like trying to win by playing defense, which I can appreciate as a basketball guy. Defense turns into offense in a finite game because you can potentially stuff the competition and go the other way, but in an infinite game, so Microsoft tries to steal the ball by creating a better iPod called the Zune that works better. Well, guess what? It didn't actually do anything to Apple. They were already moving on. They were creating something else. They were trying to play a different game already. So when they try to beat Apple at their own game and Apple's already playing a new game, it's just it's a losing battle there for Microsoft. It's a fool's errand. So, what to be done here? He says any leader who wants to adopt an infinite mindset must follow 5 essential practices: advance a just cause, build trusting teams, study your worthy rivals, prepare for existential flexibility, and demonstrate the courage to lead. This is kind of interesting. I was recently with a company that was purchased and merged, right? This happened a few years ago. And when I first joined that startup, it was it was built on phenomenal leadership and trust. And they would hire the best people they could find. And despite the urgency, they wouldn't just hire anyone. They would hire the best they could find, someone that fit the role, fit the personality, the expectations were known. And then they would send them out to the battlefield and go do your thing. And they would provide the best support they could, even though we were quite understaffed and all those typical things that companies face, especially a startup that's growing like wildfire. So later we were purchased and merged with this company. And I heard one of the leaders say in a very small group, there was only 4 or 5 of us on the call. He says, the old company was built upon exceptional individual effort. And we want to replace that with systems where people are not the drivers. Essentially saying, we don't want the value that you bring as an individual. We want to find something that can be done on spreadsheets, robotic behavior, something that we can track and scale, etc. Well, let me just tell you, it didn't work very well. And we subsequently went through 3 reorgs and 2 layoffs in about 3 years. Which, when you read the book Good to Great, the great companies had almost no organizational restructures and almost no layoffs, like a few minor layoffs, versus the good companies had sort of an addiction to reorganizations and layoffs. And so when I brought this up, it fell on deaf ears, right? So compare that to these 5 things, right? Advance a just cause, build trusting teams, study your worthy rivals, prepare for existential flexibility, and demonstrate the courage to lead. So, what a just cause is. He already wrote the book Start With Why, but a just cause is slightly different here. He says a just cause is a specific vision of the future state that does not yet exist, a future state so appealing that people are willing to make sacrifices in order to help advance toward that vision. He says winning provides a temporary thrill of victory, an intense but fleeting boost to our self confidence. None of us is able to hold on to the incredible feeling of accomplishment for that target we hit, promotion we earned, or tournament we won a year ago. Those feelings have passed. To get that feeling again, we need to try to win again. However, when there is a just cause, a reason to come to work that is bigger than any particular win, our days take on more meaning and feel more fulfilling. And that is the kind of community you want to create in your business. Those are the kind of employees you want to have, people that have some sort of energy to be attached to this just cause, something that's bigger than them. You hear people that say that all the time, like, I want to be a part of something bigger than me. I think one reason the tech industry has struggled with some of this is because tech is in itself mostly built on scalable opportunities. So basically, you scrape all this data, find the lowest common denominator that can be kind of duplicated or exponentially repeat using software instead of people. And of course, that's what makes these tech companies worth millions and millions of dollars overnight with very few employees. And so it makes sense that we're chasing these things, but it gives the employees that exist a very monotonous job and vision, right? The vision or just cause might be to serve all these people, but we're doing it in we're only doing it in the way that can be kind of replicated and scaled, done at scale, as people say constantly. Here's his outline for what a just cause must be. For something, affirmative, and optimistic. It must be inclusive, open to all who would like to contribute. Service oriented for the primary benefit of others. Resilient, able to endure political, technological, and cultural changes. Idealistic, big, bold, and ultimately unachievable. And then he spends the next several pages going into each of those in detail, which is very worthy for someone who is a leader to read that and make sure that you're in line with those things. Capitalism before freedom. The 18th century Scottish philosopher and economist is widely accepted as the father of economics and modern capitalism. Consumption, he wrote, to the wealth of nations is the sole end and purpose of all production, and the interest of the producer ought to be attended to, only so far as it may be necessary for promoting that of the consumer. He went on to explain the maxim is so perfectly self evident that it would be absurd to attempt to prove it. Put simply, the economy's interests should always be secondary to the interest of the consumer. Ironically, a point Smith believed so self evident, he felt it was absurd to try to prove it. And yet, here I am writing a whole book about it. Basically, that we need to serve people and serve a purpose and produce products and services that create progress, uplift communities, right? Not solely for the purpose of money. Capitalism abuse, the finite minded form of capitalism that exists today, bears little resemblance to the more infinite minded form that inspired Americans' founders. Thomas Jefferson owned all three volumes of Smith's Wealth of Nations and served as the bedrock for the growth of American nation. Capitalism today is in name only the capitalism that Adam Smith envisioned over 200 years ago, and it looks nothing like the capitalism practiced by companies like Ford, Kodak, Sears in the late 19th and 20th centuries before they too fell prey to finite thinking and lost their way. As Henry Ford said, a business that makes nothing but money is a poor kind of business. Companies exist to advance something, technology, quality of life, or anything else with the potential to ease or enhance our lives in some way, shape, or form. That people are willing to pay money for whatever a company has to offer is simply proof that they perceive or derive some value from those things. So I love the way he kind of, sets it up. Like America truly was founded on those kind of infinite principles. It's like individualism, creativity, freedom. You have the right to pursue, what you will. You are the owner of your own body, your own mind, and your own destiny. As long as you don't tread on others, go for it, right? And then it started to become this like the political class or the leaders, they're immune to any laws, rules, or consequences. And businesses started being created for the sake of profit and shareholder happiness. And so it's just things have sort of shifted a bit. He goes through this amazing story of Officer Colley joining a police force that had been essentially built on number of tickets you could put in, and the community did not trust the force because they were constantly run like a business with a finite mindset, trying to make more money and have more profit as an organization, which the police force is not put in place to do that. They're there to serve the community and create positive impact in their community and fight crime. So Kali implemented all these strategies to infuse trust into his force and into the community, and the turnaround was phenomenal. And they basically created some of this community policing. There's a section in here called "A Culture of Pressure, Demands, and Incentives," and he goes over this study from 1973. Two Princeton University psychology professors, John M. Darley and C. Daniel Batson, conducted an experiment to better understand how situational variables can affect our ethics, specifically how pressure impacts our will to help someone in distress. So they set up these scenarios where uh, they had basically an actor in distress, but they would had people that were on an errand to go do something, and they had pressure to get it done. And the more pressure that people had, the less likely they were to actually assist this distressed person. And the goal of the study was essentially that, to find out, um, does our moral code kind of change when we're under distress versus when we're not? And yes, it does. So when businesses add constant stress to hit metrics and they don't express enough interest or trust, or have enough of those kind of trust building activities and cultural things in their system, people start to make worse decisions on behalf of the company, which is not what you want. He said, add an unbalanced reward structure that focuses on performance and ignores trust, and the ethical lapses start to move as if they were sliding down a slip and slide coated in Teflon, covered in baby oil, until they reach full blown ethical fading at the end. And one of the prime stories that he uses to illustrate this is Wells Fargo. They put in an incentive program that was so set on hitting targets and numbers with no checks and balances that people started creating fake accounts in order to hit these metrics so that they wouldn't be in trouble. It wasn't to serve people, it was to hit metrics to keep off the bad list and make sure they got their paychecks so that they could feed their families. And not too long later, they are in a multi-million dollar lawsuit for abusing customer information and personal accounts and things like that, creating fake accounts. It was chaos. That is not what we want in businesses or public organizations. Now, I love this section. It starts in chapter 9, and there's a great deal of information here on worthy rivals. So he tells his own personal story. As a writer, an author, speaker, right, trying to improve businesses and culture, he had a worthy rival who originally he hated as a competitor. His name's Adam Grant, who is also in this industry, but takes a different approach. And he says that he would constantly look up book ratings and see who was winning and all this stuff, right? And then they had to share the stage together in a conference, and they were told to introduce one another. And so he admitted that he makes him very uncomfortable because all of his strengths are all of Simon's weaknesses, etc. Anyway, he says, in an instant, I understood the reason why I felt so competitive with him. The way I saw him had nothing to do with him, it had to do with me. When his name came up, it reminded me of the areas in which I grappled. Instead of investing my energy on improving myself, overcoming my weaknesses, or building on my strengths, it was easier to focus on beating him. That's how competition works, right? It's a drive to win. The problem was all the metrics of who was ahead and who was behind were arbitrary, and I set the standards for comparison. Plus, there was no finish line, so I was attempting to compete in an unwinnable race. I had made a classic finite mindset blunder. The truth is, even though we do similar things, he isn't my competitor. He is my rival, my very worthy rival. They became great friends. They've worked together many times. In fact, Adam Grant proofread this book for him. But he goes into what a worthy rival is. It's a focus, something or someone that shows you your weak spots and something that you might want to refocus or redefine your goal, your worthy cause, right? Instead of Microsoft viewing Apple's iPod as something that was to be competed with, Microsoft could have used that opportunity to say, look, they just innovated a whole industry. Is that an industry we want to try and get ahead of and work on and innovate? Do we want to create our own sort of iTunes or what's the next level of an iPod, something like that? Or are we a company that does something else? Do we want to focus on our software services for personal computers or business industry or something, right? They could have redefined their cause and made it work, and instead they took it as a finite minded challenge, which did not turn out well for them. He says, if we are a player in a finite game, however, we have to stop thinking of other players as competitors and be beaten and start thinking of them as worthy rivals who can help us become better players. A worthy rival is another player in the game worthy of comparison. They may be our sworn enemies or sometimes collaborators or colleagues. Regardless of who they are or where we find them, the main point is that they do something or many things as well as or better than us. They may make a superior product, command greater loyalty, or better leaders, or act with clearer sense of purpose than we do. We simply acknowledge that they have strengths and abilities from which we could learn a thing or two. Skipping down, we choose them to be our worthy rivals because there is something about them that reveals to us our weaknesses and pushes us to constantly improve, which is essential if we want to be strong enough to stay in the game. So, a worthy rival is a challenger. It's someone who shows us our weaknesses or our strengths, someone who shows potential for future progress, things that we could focus on and change and capitalize on. So we need to stop thinking of a worthy rival as a competitor to smash, to beat, and rather someone who exposes new insight to us. A worthy rival inspires us to take on an attitude of improvement. The former focuses our attitude on the outcome, the latter focuses our attention on process. Skipping down, another reason to adjust our perspective towards seeing strong players in our field as worthy rivals is it helps keep us honest. Going back to his Adam Grant comparison and story, right? He says he helped him read this book and make it better. All these things. He says, fun fact: in an infinite game, we can both succeed. Turns out people can actually buy more than one book. An infinite mindset embraces abundance, whereas a finite mindset operates with a scarcity mentality. In the infinite game, we accept that being the best is a fool's errand and that multiple players can do well at the same time. Worthy rivals can help us get better at what we do. So I loved this story. He talks about Alan Mulally, who left the airplane industry to take over as CEO of Ford in 2006. Now, Ford was falling apart. A lot of people did not like their cars compared to like Toyota and Honda and things like that. So he went about kind of exploring the competitors, driving their cars, seeing what was good about theirs. He drove every single Ford car multiple times and tried to get to the bottom of this, but he did not want his competitors crushed. He took out a giant loan in 2006 to help reinvent Ford, and then in 2008, when the big car players in America were going down, Ford was okay. And when it came to him expressing his opinion to the federal government on these bailouts, he actually wanted them to bail out the competition, or what he would call his worthy rivals. Uh, GM and others who were going bankrupt. A lot of leaders of a company would have loved to see that happen, but he had a belief that they used suppliers that he also uses, and a lot of people's jobs would be affected and things like that. And so these worthy rivals were actually helpful to him and Ford, versus getting rid of them would have negative effects. And so he wanted them to get the bailout. He said, having one primary worthy rival has huge advantages. It provides for a single point of focus for strategies to be developed, resources to be allocated, and the attentions of internal factions to be pointed. So he went about reinventing the vision of Ford and having this vision of how we can serve our people better and make our cars something that people want, rather than trying to smash the competition. And of course, Ford has done very well since that time. Another example that Simon points out is the Cold War. And that it was drawn out forever. A lot of people had this finite mindset that we won the Cold War, or this, whatever. But he says, um, one thing about that war is that it gave America kind of a united vision of what the threats were and where the opportunities were. So he says, having one primary worthy rival has huge advantages. It provides for a single point of focus for strategies to be developed, resources to be allocated, and the attentions of internal factions to be pointed. So later on, he says even Republicans and Democrats used to be able to agree that the Soviet Union represented a greater threat to the United States than each other and could always come together in a clear common cause. That is no longer the case. Absent an identified external worthy rival, the two parties now see each other as the existential threat to the nation. All the while, the real threats to America grow even stronger. So I'm going to leave you with that one, but this book is filled with excellent examples and descriptions of what a finite mindset looks like and how leaders in finite games run companies, and that it's all about the shareholders and profits and those things, and that incentive programs destroy morale and productivity and the long game, versus an infinite leader and an infinite mindset, which is about staying in the game as long as we can, serving as many people as we can for as long as we can, and pivoting when needed. And so, very excellent book. I encourage you to buy this one and follow its rules. This is one that you might have to study over and over and make sure you're implementing as a leader. But The Infinite Game by Simon Sinek. The link is in the show notes. Thank you guys for listening. Catch you on the next one.